Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you. I hope you all had a wonderful Easter. So we are very happy to continue our year-long look at the 250th anniversary of America. We've looked at many different facets of it, and we're so happy to bring it local. Today we have Edie Adam here, and she retired in 2015, moved back to Telford, and has the purpose of a member of the Souderton Telford Historical Society. Edie and I had spoken about coming to have her speak. Also, I'm sure she'll be saying a little bit about the tours that you're offering in May. And today she's going to present Vignettes in Pink, a look at the lives of women in this area early in the 20th century through the use of anecdotes and historical sources, including the local newspaper. How many of you have lived in Souderton, Telford area for most of your lives? Okay, this is for all of you. And if you're a newbie to the area like myself, just through work, I'm sure we're going to learn a little bit as well. Please welcome Edie Adams.
Thank you. So this is a sound check. Anyone not able to hear? Okay, good afternoon. I apologize for sitting and not standing, but I think this audience will understand. So thank you for the invitation to speak this afternoon. I am from the Souderton Telford Historical Society, and we're here to talk about the lives of women in the period of Souderton's first 50 years or so. So we're talking 1887 to about World War II. And since we are focusing on women this afternoon, pink is the color of the day. Or maybe not. Did you know that before the mid-1800s, both male and female babies were dressed in long white cotton dresses until about age 6? It was only in the early part of the 20th century that marketers started telling mothers that babies should be dressed in designated gender colors. And this is what they advised mothers of the period. Pink is a much stronger color and therefore more suitable for the boys, while dainty blue is prettier for the girl. If you can wrap your head around boys dressed in pink, you're doing better than I am. So we're going to start over and be historically accurate and do vignettes in blue. I'm going to mix in some history and some context with anecdotes gathered from the Souderton Independent, and for those I'd like to thank our researcher, Corey Alderfer. World War I, which the United States entered in 1917, changed American society, as the wars tend to do. These two posters spoke to the roles that women played in the war, on the home front, and overseas. And it's not too different from those that they would play in World War II. Locally, Sisters Stella and Eva Sauder, along with Mrs. Henry Weidemoyer, formed the Soldiers' Welfare Society. And benefits were held as the women raised money and collected items such as towels, soap, and newspapers to be sent to the men. In September 1918, the newspaper mentioned that Mrs. Abram B. Price and Mrs. Norman Frederick and her son Alfred were among those in town who were sick with the grip, a common name for influenza. The pandemic that later became known as the Spanish influenza had struck home. By October 4, 200 cases were noted in town. More than 100 children were absent from school, and it got worse from there. Eva Sauder and her sister Stella both contracted severe cases but survived. Their friend, Katie Lou Weidemoyer, did not. She died November 21, 1918, at the age of 24. The Soldiers' Welfare Society was a traditional activity for women of means to lead, but by World War I, women had already been exercising their power for several decades. Historian Heather Cox Richardson wrote about the 1890s, when women started to understand that the household purse gave them power to demand change. The National Consumers League put it this way: to live means to buy means to have power, and to have power means to have responsibility. These women saw a need to repair the fabric of a society that had been tattered by industrialization and urbanization, and they acted. We see this locally, too. Articles in the newspaper point to women taking their household management skills into the wider world. They were banding together to leverage their power through social organizations in the same way the men were doing with the Rotary, the Lions, the Kiwanis, and others. It was good work, but still lampooned in this poem the newspaper carried. The author may have been amused, but the women of Souderton and Telford were on the march. In 1937, a club listing included the Souderton-Telford Women's Club, the Souderton-Telford Ladies Auxiliary of Grandview Hospital, the Ladies Auxiliary of Perseverance Volunteer Fire Company No. 1, the Community First Aid Unit, the Souderton branch of the Needlework Guild of America, the Souderton Girl Scouts, and the Molly Pitcher Council Daughters of America. Another area in which women practiced their leadership skills was the church. In 1911, the Ladies' Aid Society of Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Souderton was marking its 10th anniversary. The society's object was to aid in the building of a new church. In 10 years, the ladies had raised almost $1,800. That's the equivalent of more than $61,000 today. The society bought pews and carpeting, church books and hymn tablets, as well as contributing to the new organ. Miss Emma Cope, the secretary, reported on this success at the celebration and noted her hope that such an organization is not only a support to the church financially, but also a source of inspiration and assistance to both pastor and congregation. The work these ladies groups did may be seen in the many activities the newspaper reported on over the decades every week. Telford's Trinity Reformed Church had it formed an aid society in 1897. From 1922 to this report in 1927, Trinity's ladies raised funds from a cake and pie sale, 3 chicken suppers, and the Thimble Social, among other activities. Despite these successes, some churches weren't quite ready to give women a greater say in congregational life. The Southwestern Pennsylvania Conference of the Mennonite Church in 1921 made that very clear in a resolution that was adopted. While woman occupies an important place in religious work, and her presence in the religious field is vital to the church, she shall hold no position of authority over the brethren of the church. Still, there was a hint of change in the air. While the senior elders vigorously supported this resolution, many younger members of the conference voted no. Women did have influence in many areas of life, but it would be years before they could claim the right to participate fully in governing. Republican politicians in the 1890 election had blamed women for their losses. Why the women couldn't vote, but they could tell the men in their lives who had supported the McKinley tariffs about the effect those taxes had on their household budget. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 guaranteed women the right to vote. Now they could support representatives who shared their interests and goals, and this 1899 ad for Ivory Soap suggested how they would vote for what is pure and what is good. November 1920 was the first national election in which Pennsylvania's women could vote, and the newspaper performed the public service of informing female readers about the process. The same qualifications of voters which now apply to men will also apply to women, it said. Enrollment or assessment was entirely voluntary. No woman must enroll if she does not want to vote. When being assessed, a voter was not required to declare a party preference, and it is not a high crime if she enrolls and then fails to vote. But those who enrolled to vote had to pay a poll tax, among other requirements. The tax ranged from 20 to 40 cents, depending on your gender and economic status. 20 cents sounds manageable, but 30 cents in 1920 could buy you a pound of chicken. Once women gained the right to vote, you can see attitudes beginning to change. So here are 2 points of view that are less than a decade apart. Montana had given women the vote in 1914. At left, you can see how newspapers reported on Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin from Montana when she spoke during the vote on whether to go to war in 1917. She is described as having a catch in her voice, half sobbing and haggard from the unaccustomed excitement. At right, after women across the nation gained the same right, politicians started paying attention. All the county legislators attended this tea held by the League of Women Voters. One legislator told the newspaper he was a man of action, but he would listen to what the women wanted from their state government. 36% of eligible women voted in 1920 versus 68% of men. Barriers to voting included literacy tests, long residence requirements, and the poll taxes. But even then, a woman's right to vote was not secure. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the 19th Amendment had been properly ratified by the states and was the law. A lawyer in Maryland had sued, arguing that the state constitution only granted suffrage to men, and therefore the state could not be forced to do the same for women. He lost. Maryland did ratify the amendment in 1941, but only certified its vote in 1958. It would be 1980 before the female turnout in elections matched that of men, and the struggle for full representation in all the corridors of power continues to this day. Just to be fair to Congresswoman Rankin, she was feisty. She was a lifelong feminist, a suffragette, a pacifist, and a social reformer who traveled widely for her causes. Born in Montana, she studied in New York and was a social worker in Seattle. She was the first woman to serve in Congress, having been elected as a Republican in 1916. She is the only woman ever to vote in Congress for giving women the right to vote. Her suffragette friends had urged her to support going to war in 1917, fearful that a no vote would brand women as weak and unfit for politics. She still voted no and lost in the next election, but she was elected again in 1940 and again voted no on going to war in 1941. So she does not sound like the type of woman to be overcome by unaccustomed excitement. The same could be said of Florence Knapp. She was born on the family farm in Montgomery Township in the years after the Civil War ended and lived in the same house until age 110, when she broke her hip and moved to a nursing home. Miss Knapp was officially recognized as the oldest person in the world shortly before her death in 1988 at the age of 114. In interviews, she talked about marching in 1919 in Philadelphia for voting rights. She described carrying a banner that said, "Votes for Women," when a gust of wind lifted her 4 feet into the air, still hanging on to the banner. Miss Knapp voted for the first time in 1920 at the age of 47 and took pride in her voting record. She also taught school for 42 years. Teaching was one of the few careers that a single woman could pursue. Girls finished school at 16 and went right into teaching with little or no formal training. But the death toll of the Civil War, along with a growing economy in the northern states, opened the doors to extended education for more girls. By 1870, girls were the majority of high school graduates, and although less than 2% of Americans of college age actually attended college, women were 21% of those who did. Up to this time, men were the teachers, and they were teaching mostly boys. But industrialization also created opportunities for men to work in other professions. At the same time, immigration inspired a push toward public education to assimilate the newcomers. The population of children grew, and all of this caused a crisis in education. The answer was to bring more women into the profession, and soon most teachers were women, seeking independence and purpose. But men still were the majority of administrators, and the conditions under which the women worked, including low pay, brought about efforts in the early 20th century to change things. Unions emerged, and annual pay increased, as did the opportunity for career progression. We see from the newspaper that female teachers were a frequent topic of discussion. There were shortages of teachers and difficulty in filling vacancies. The school at Perkiomenville was closed for weeks for a lack of a teacher. Some districts required female teachers to stay through the entire school year. A female teacher who married presumably would not return to the classroom afterward, instead focusing on her own family life. But rules requiring a full term were more than some women would accept, feeling that their choices about if or when to marry would be limited. This editorial writer took a look at the same problem and instead pointed to competition for trained, unmarried female employees. Office work was opening new opportunities to earn money. Our editorial writer concludes with a familiar argument. Teacher salaries were not competitive with those available in other fields, and that must be reckoned with by the school directors. Despite these challenges, we have a great example of a woman making a lifelong career out of teaching. We track Sally Rogers through the U.S. Census. In 1880, she was Sally Fluke, a 20-year-old teacher living in West Rock Hill with her parents. In 1900, she was a married mother and teacher. Ditto for 1910. In 1920, she's living on County Line Road and teaching. Finally, in 1930, Sally, at the age of 70, was still working as a teacher. As time went by, even marriage in the middle of the school year was no longer a deterrence. Our newsletter archive includes the memory of a young baby boomer student in Telford. Her first grade teacher, Miss Claus, went on the Christmas break and returned as Mrs. Labs, confusing the young students. Miss Claus had gotten married over the holiday. All that said, we should admire the courage of these young women pursuing a teaching career. In many cases, they left their family homes to move to unknown towns and villages to teach. They boarded with families who were strangers and were on their own from relatively young ages. In 1932, the borough was quite proud of its new high school. It was the jewel of a school system that served Satterton. Although no woman had yet been elected to serve as a school director, most of the faculty in all the schools were women, some of whom you may still remember. If you were a working class child, you were going out to earn money by age 13 or 14. Often your pay was turned over to your parents, especially in the larger farm families, and you might receive an allowance. We read of a case in which a woman married before she was 21. Her husband had to pay her father the amount of money she would have earned up to age 21. And I'm told this was a common practice well into the 1950s. As industry moved into Satterton and Telford, the children's mothers now also entered the workforce. The newspaper reported in 1928 that average earnings for a working man were not keeping pace with the cost of living, and that many of their wives were forced to go out to work to make ends meet. The government also reported that about 20% of the women working in industry were foreign-born, meaning they were immigrants. The 1920s were a peak time for immigration and anti-immigrant rhetoric and legislation. Let's spend a minute on this question of women working outside the home. 10 years after the previous report, now in 1938, the newspaper carried the editorial here. The author starts off by pointing out that wives often shared in the work their husbands did to support their families and careers. To my eyes, the farmer's wife, or the minister's wife, or the storekeeper's wife, they were partners in the family business. But then we learn that many women in this time, almost 11 million based on the 1930 census, are working outside their homes for the very simple reason that they had to. People were depending on them, and as she earned more, the more people she supported. So, yes, there are women who do work for their own self-esteem or to support themselves, but then, just as now, many are employed because others need them to be. And that's another debate that has followed us into the 21st century. Working outside the home put women on the front lines when the union movement came to town. One target in 1935 was the Montgomery Clothing Company. On July 18, the paper reported the allegation that union organizers were attempting to intimidate workers by vandalizing 3 homes, including that of William Heller in Souderton. Mrs. Heller, who returned to work when the company's Culpsville plant had reopened a week earlier, was considerably scared when a brick was thrown through the glass of the front door. The Silverdale home of her sister, a fellow employee, was also vandalized. On August 1, the newspaper reported that several employees on their way from Boyertown to the factory to picket were injured when their car overturned near Harleysville. 4 of the 6 injured in the accident were women. People were starting to take notice of the number of women contributing to the state's economic activity. This chart from 1928 notes that women were not only employees in factories and offices, but also owners hiring other women. Look through the Souderton 50th Anniversary Souvenir Book, and you'll see women running businesses large and small, and that includes the Souderton Independent. In March 1930, the paper itself reported the new management. The Mrs. Thelma and Helen Gettler would assume their late father's partnership stake in the company. 10 years later, in the 1940 census, Helen had married Arden Moyer, the advertising manager, and was the mother of 3 children and still working as publisher. Her sister had apparently stepped away. Miss Ella Barnt had opened a beauty parlor in 1922 in Souderton and was later joined by Miss Ella DeHaven, and together they operated the D Bar Beauty Shop. The Mitzi Dress Shop was opened in 1933 by Mrs. Martha Hartzell. In 1934, Miss Pearl Fox joined the business, which specialized in dresses, coats, hats, blouses, and skirts. And we are assured that both Mrs. Hartzell and Miss Fox make regular trips to New York City to stay up with the latest trends. A year earlier, in 1932, Mrs. Catherine Beale opened her ladies' shop on Main Street. Mrs. Ziegler, wife of the local photographer D.F. Ziegler, had run a millinery business for about 30 years by 1937. And years earlier, in 1887, Mrs. E.S. Landis was holding a sale of her nursery stock. We can also find women listed among the resident freeholders, the property owners of the soon-to-be borough, and signing the petition for incorporation. They included Sally Ann Slifer, Sally Leidy, Annie Freed, Hannah Cope, Elizabeth Schellenberger, and Elizabeth Schuck. It appears women also were running their own medical practices. On January 3, 1946, the newspaper announced that Dr. Harry Nice was to be associated with Mrs. Gaylord A. Buchanan, Jr. at her office on East Broad Street, Souderton. Before her marriage, she was Dr. Esther C. Montgomery. It was front page news in 1936 when Souderton High School graduate Violet Kidd received her Doctor of Medicine degree from Temple University. She was one of 7 women to complete the program. We can also thank registered nurse Carolyn Geiser for founding the ambulance service and an answering service that was used by many doctors in the area. Up to this time, medical care was largely provided by graduate nurses and family members, and included a fair share of home remedy and superstition. Midwives assisted in pregnancy and birth. Grandview Hospital came along in 1913, and medical treatment slowly was professionalized. We have seen that women of all classes played important roles outside the home. Those fortunate to be able to hire household help had time to take their skills into society. For those in the working class, the opportunities to earn money were also growing. For homemakers, life was changing too. New inventions eased their labor, and ladies' magazines promoted best practices for skills such as sewing, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, gardening, and home renovation and decorating. Twice in 1935, the Independent reported that Mrs. Harold Leidy had been honored by Better Homes and Gardens magazine. In March, her recipe for favorite pie cake was recognized, and in July, she received the same distinction for her lemon sponge pie. Today, when we have millions of recipes at our fingertips, we might not appreciate what an accomplishment that was. Certification meant that the recipe had passed tests for dependability, excellence of taste, and family usefulness. If you've ever looked at early cookbooks, the ingredients were measured by eye or by taste, and the instructions said things like, make a dough. To have a source that provided standards for achieving success regardless of skill was a big help. Reading recipes also can be revealing. We might assume that very few husbands visited the kitchen, much less did the cooking, but Better Homes puts that stereotype to rest. Here we have a winning recipe for ham goulash from Henry Tetlow of Center Square, PA, just down the road from us. In another case, the editor wrote, speaking of men cooks, we recently had a recipe called Son of a Gun from a hard-boiled cowboy on a New Mexico ranch, proving once again that cookery is not effeminate. So how's that for a twist on your assumptions? But even the best-kept home was not immune to society's ills. Prohibition was the law from 1920 to 1933 and could bring women of all ranks together. Montgomery County had its own branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1927, meeting in Lansdale, it adopted a resolution to encourage prosecution of drunken driving. We have Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which came along in 1980, but for women, this was an issue long before. Women at times did find themselves on the wrong side of the law, and the newspaper did not refrain from letting their neighbors know about it. Here we have an alleged disorderly house in Almont and a couple of women who challenged prohibition. Bootlegging was serious business, often run by organized crime. Poisoned alcohol killed thousands of people. Still, I can't help but want to meet the lady who mixed bootlegging with her many church activities. Here's a young woman who stuck to her guns on the issue of alcohol and found herself in the newspaper. Rose Shoemaker was underage, and her father's permission was required to marry. Her groom-to-be picked up the father on the way to the courthouse to obtain a marriage license. Being a hot day, he treated the old man to a cool beer. Rose learned of this, and when the groom arrived to take her to the minister for the wedding, she broke the engagement and sent him away. As we see the ways that women were moving into less traditional roles, we should also acknowledge that Souderton and Telford were more diverse communities than we might imagine. The country was changing as railroads and automobiles made it easier to seek opportunities for a better life. Immigrants from around the world brought their customs and talents with them to small towns where they contributed to their community. While it's harder to uncover those stories, we can give you a peek into an active Jewish community in Souderton. It included medical professionals, store owners, and businessmen and women. Here we see pharmacist Irving Krasner in front of his modern storefront, built in 1953, just in time for Souderton's 75th anniversary. Krasner had bought the business in 1942. Among the retailers in town were two clothing stores. Rudolph Hope emigrated to Philadelphia from Germany in 1904 and later moved to Souderton to design clothes for Zent Brothers wholesalers. Hope opened his clothing store in 1920, selling both custom-made and ready-to-wear. H.A. Goldberg was another immigrant who came to Souderton. He was 15 when he arrived in New York from Lithuania in 1905. In 1922, Goldberg opened his store on East Broad Street here. He said he was comfortable among our Mennonite community because Pennsylvania Dutch and Yiddish were similar languages. In 1941, Goldberg was one of a group of conservative Jews who established Congregation Beth Israel, their community's first synagogue. Those organizing efforts that resulted in the synagogue began years earlier, and both Mr. and Mrs. Goldberg took a leading role in 1929 when a community center was set up in Lansdale. He was named treasurer of the committee, and she was named financial secretary of the Ladies' Auxiliary. A year later, in 1930, the Ladies' Auxiliary held a mammoth dinner during Hanukkah and raised $3,500 for the future synagogue. Again, the newspaper published a detailed account noting that people came from Philadelphia and New York to support the event. By the way, $3,500 in 1930, that's almost $68,000 today. So as with the Christian women who use their skills to benefit their churches, the Jewish women of Souderton and Telford did the same. Also among the group that founded the synagogue was the Reuben family in Souderton. Barney Reuben owned several businesses, including the town junkyard, the Reliance Inn, and a hotel near Harleysville. His wife, Molly Reuben, was also in business, having opened a dining parlor in the basement of Mrs. Rosenberger's tenant house in July 1917. But it closed only a few months later. Molly was already ill with the cancer that would end her life in 1918. Her obituary noted that she was well known and had a large circle of friends. Molly's daughter Fanny immigrated with her mother and stepfather in the late 1890s. A family story has it that as a teen, Fanny was up to her elbows scrubbing the cast iron stove in her father's inn when Louis Sheets walked in to find her covered with soot. It was a messy start to a relationship that ended in marriage shortly after. The Reubens' daughter Tilly died in 1934 in the home of her sister and brother-in-law. Tilly was an active volunteer in the Needlework Guild and with the Fire Company Auxiliary, and Barney Reuben died in 1938. One of the most important occasions in a Jewish family's life was the circumcision of a newborn son. The newspaper provided all the details when the ceremony was performed for Mr. and Mrs. Saul Levy in Souderton. Friends and relatives traveled all the way from Philadelphia in 1904. Dr. Bauman represented the medical profession, and all were treated to an elegant repast when the business was done. Shifting traditions are one thing, but it was a surprise to read in 1930 that women in one college were telling pollsters that marriage was not their goal in life, citing the concern that their personalities would be submerged into their husbands. Florence Knapp, who we met earlier, spoke about this in 1988. Once there was a boy who was crazy about me. He said he was in love with me and couldn't think of anything but me. I liked him well enough, but to think of him day and night and if nothing else? No, I thought of lots of things all the time. She did regret that she never married, she told an interviewer, but added that may have been one of the reasons she lived so long. I'm guessing that it was a male writer who saw this poll and had a few thoughts to share, particularly the bit about the woman's husband reinforcing her identity through his experience. He suggests that these women, university educated, likely white and privileged, should marry because the world would not fare well if intelligent women lost interest in having children. That view is concerning given the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism at the time, but in the modern year, when it was reported that the nation's birth rate was down 25% since 2007, the caricature was easy to trot out again. Privileged, highly educated women have chosen cats over children. Today, women can marry and maintain their own identity without too much of a second thought. But back when that poll was taken, women had historical reasons to be concerned. It's called coverture, and it means that a woman has no legal identity. A daughter belonged to her father until she married, and then the husband and wife were treated as one. A woman could not own property or keep any money she earned and had no right to her body or her children. An unmarried woman had more legal rights, but few opportunities to exercise them. Real life was not as extreme as the law might allow. Souderton did have female property owners, as we saw earlier. But while we've chipped away at coverture over the decades, you can still find pieces of it around today. In the 1970s, a wife could not get most types of credit, including bank credit cards, in their own names. This was true for a friend of mine when she applied at a local bank. Even Hillary Clinton has said she could not get a credit card in her name in the early 1970s, despite making more money as a lawyer than her husband did as Attorney General of Arkansas. President Ford signed the Equal Opportunity Credit Act into law in 1974. Hopes in Souderton gave my friend her own store credit card account, which she used to build her credit rating. An active women's rights movement needed an icon to represent the spirit of change and progress it wanted to inspire. The new woman of the 1890s, young, college-educated, active in sports, interested in a career, and wanting a marriage based on equality, was routinely depicted on a bicycle. Riding was a national fad at the time, and Souderton and Telford eagerly joined the trend with riding clubs. But seeing girls and women with their legs astride the bike raised questions, the most pressing of which was, how in the days of long, heavy skirts and bustles could a woman ride a bicycle and still exhibit modesty and femininity? The problem was finally resolved by a contest. The winning costume was a divided dress skirt held by suspenders, a silk blouse held at the waist by a rubber band, a jacket made of the same cloth or flannel as the skirt, in shades of black, gray, navy, or brown, a Windsor tie at the neck, a yachting cap, gauntlet gloves, and for underwear, a union suit. This one-piece undergarment, patented in 1868, had been designed for women to free them of the constrictive underwear of the time. Bikes could take women where they wanted to go, when they wanted to go, and those bicycle clubs did the same as the clubs we started with. They lobbied for change. That included better roads. So by 1903, when the earliest automobiles were being purchased by Southertonians, our streets were well on the way to becoming safer, better constructed, and easier to navigate. Women's fashions were regularly covered in the newspaper. There were reports from the fashion capitals of the world, as well as advice for the woman keeping up with the trends. And it wasn't just clothing and accessories. The home itself now had to be fashionable. Kitchen colors, room layouts, window coverings, all could change with the trends. These images are especially informative. Your hair was ornamented, as was your ankle, with an ankle corsage. It was one of the more unusual fads of the day. The newspapers cited Parisian creators of fashion for this trend. Of course, getting the corsage at just the right point, below the skirt bottom, but above the shoe top, was important, and naturellement, one must have a dainty ankle. I have my doubts as to how many women in Southerton or Telford wore ankle corsages. These reports, just like today's fashion magazines, are aspirational for most of us. But the trends gave the newspaper plenty of ammunition to mock, gently or otherwise, and here are a few examples gathered from the pages. Some of these comments had a more scientific tone to them. I can imagine that wearing a crinoline that had an electric charge was neither comfortable nor safe. And I have long wondered about all those dresses dragging through the muck. Sometimes the commentary seemed especially silly, as you can see from this string of notes about bangs, of all things. And it is encouraging to see that the male of the species was sometimes called out for his vanity and foolishness too. Men were chided for doing no more than using a shoe brush to wipe the eggshells or clam chowder from their whiskers. Or John Hendricks, who insisted at his surprise birthday party that he was only 40 until his mother brought out proof that he was 3 years older. And this picture takes the tailors to task. The caption writer asks, "Whatever happened to our regular He-Man trousers?" We'll give the last word to Will Hemsing, Mayor of Southerton from 1913 to 1916. His diaries have been published, and in this entry from 1885, he makes clear his opinion of the trends. So I've given you a little glimpse at some of the choices that women were able to make in the early years of Southerton Borough. Before World War I and the influenza pandemic, We wore our hair long, our skirts to the floor, and corsets kept everything in place. Then came voting rights and education and employment opportunities and the jazz age. Young women bobbed their hair, shortened their hems, and threw away the corsets. We drank giggle water at speakeasies, and life was swell. That's a lot of change to absorb, so here's a quick look at how the jazz age was viewed in the pages of our newspaper. The flapper era is always pictured to be fun and lighthearted, as with the bob-haired bathing beauties who surrounded the police detective sent to warn them off the Bethlehem Pike. It also raised some serious concerns, as here where the practice of bathing beauty contests was discussed at the League of Nations in connection with the trafficking of women. Even today we have learned about what can go wrong when young women seeking fame in Hollywood or elsewhere come to the notice of those with evil intent. This husband, I assume, was not pleased with his wife's new look, even if it did come from Paris. Maybe she bought it at the Mitzi dress shop. And how different is this from our modern social media influencers promising to change your life along with your looks? And this fashionable young lady was not going to cover up for old man Winter no matter what. And on a more serious note, family debates over the length of the kids' hair is nothing new. Some of you may remember long-haired boys and their crew-cut fathers. Sad that in this case, the argument over a daughter's haircut, which the father had said had shorn her of her crowning glory, apparently ended in a broken home. I mentioned our researcher, Corey Aldifer, who has been systematically going through decades of the Souderton Independent from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, capturing all kinds of historical information. The editors of the Independent like to tweak their neighbors, occasionally with a humorous approach to the news, and here are a couple of Corey's favorites. I'll give you a second to read. I like the last one. And here's one more. Here's the story behind this. The wife rushed into the telegraph office in Souderton. She had sent her husband into the city for a Sunday school banner, but had forgotten to tell him how big to make it and what it should say. So she wrote a telegram, and the operator sent it on, and this is the punchline. 8 feet long, 2 feet wide. I think the husband is still in shock. And here are 2 more examples of when women were memorialized. It appears that the tennis battle of the sexes 50 years ago wasn't the first time that a woman went head-to-head with a man. And just before the turn of the 20th century, 2 local women made history just for taking a drive. As I was writing this presentation, I got an email from IKEA about its color of the year for 2026. It's called Rebel Pink. It's bold, unapologetic, full of energy, playful, expressive, and a little bit rebellious. And that sounds like a good way to describe women of any time. So I invite you to visit our website for our newspaper archive and subscribe to receive your copy via email. We also have a Facebook page that carries posts of local historical interest. If you have memories to share or old photos we can scan, please feel free to contact us. And if you wish, Your donation helps us to continue our work to preserve the places and people around us. And I also ask you to keep an eye out for our special event in May. We're marking the 250th anniversary of the United States. We're excited that these churches are opening their doors and welcoming the community for an afternoon of local history and art appreciation. Basically, it's a self-guided tour through Souderton and Telford locations where you will be able to go into these churches that normally you might just drive by and get information about the art, the stained glass, the architecture, as well as the history of the buildings and the congregations. I have a QR code there if you're one of those with a cell phone, and I did bring a couple flyers if you'd like to take one with you. And I'll say thank you very much for coming today. I hope you enjoyed learning about the lives of women.
Thank you all for coming today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day with the sunshine. And again, special thanks to Edie for bringing so much good information to us today. And if you wanted to talk to Edie afterwards, please stick around. I'm sure she'd be happy to do so.
Absolutely.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.